The sound of explosions never leaves you. They echo in your mind decades after the war ends, reverberating through every quiet moment, every peaceful night, every celebration, every holiday, and each one carries with it the memory of everyone you lost, everyone who should have made it home but didn't, everyone whose life was cut short by violence and chaos and the random cruelty of war. And I am 91 years old now, and I still hear them, still feel them vibrating in my chest like they're happening right this moment, still see the flash of light that took my best friend away from me in the Pacific Ocean during World War II. And I need to tell you this story because staying silent has been killing me slowly for 79 years, eating away at me from the inside like a cancer, leaving me hollow and broken in ways that no one can see, but that I feel with every single breath I take, with every beat of my failing heart. My name is Harvey Daniels. I am 91 years old, and I served in the United States Navy in the Pacific Theater during World War II, and I watched my closest friend, a boy named James Patrick McCarthy, who was 22 years old when he died, perish in an explosion aboard our destroyer, the USS Callahan. And there was nothing I could do except watch the flames consume the place where he had been standing just seconds before, watch the ship tear itself apart, watch the smoke pour out black and thick and toxic, and that image has been burned into my memory more permanently than any photograph could ever be, more vividly than any film footage, more clearly than anything else in my entire long life, because it was real, and it was right in front of me, and it changed everything. I thought I knew about life and death and friendship and loyalty and the random cruelty of war and the unfairness of a universe that takes good people, bright, promising young people with their whole lives ahead of them, and leaves broken ones like me behind to carry the weight of their absence for the rest of our days. Before I go any further with this story that has defined my entire existence, that has shaped every decision I have made, that has colored every relationship I have had, every joy I have experienced, every sorrow I have endured, I want you to comment below and tell me where you are watching this from, what country, what city, what part of the world, because James never got to see most of this planet. He never traveled beyond the Pacific Islands where we fought and bled and died, where we watched our friends get blown apart or burned alive or drown in the cold, dark water, and I want to know that his memory is reaching places he never got to go, that somehow through my words and through this story, he is traveling farther than he ever could in his short, abbreviated life, that his name and his story and his dreams are spreading across continents and oceans, crossing borders and time zones, reaching into homes and hearts thousands of miles away, that he is not completely forgotten, that he still matters 79 years after his death, that his life had meaning even though it was far too brief. And if you have ever lost someone suddenly, someone who was there one moment and gone the next, someone whose absence left a hole in your life that nothing has ever filled, comment the number 1 below, because I need to know that other people understand this particular kind of grief, this shock that never quite wears off, no matter how many decades pass, no matter how much therapy you get, or how many times people tell you it wasn't your fault, this feeling of disbelief that someone so vital, so alive, so full of energy and dreams and potential and plans for the future, could just cease to exist in an instant, could be erased from the world as completely as if they had never been here at all, as if their hopes and fears and loves and losses meant nothing in the face of random violence and blind chance. James was from Boston, from a working-class Irish Catholic family in Dorchester, the youngest of 5 children, and his father Patrick worked on the docks, loading and unloading cargo ships, breaking his back every day to put food on the table, and his mother Mary took in laundry and did sewing repairs for the wealthy families on Beacon Hill to help make ends meet, and they were poor but proud, the kind of people who always paid their debts, no matter how long it took, who always held their heads high no matter what life threw at them, who believed in hard work and honesty, and the idea that if you did right by people, they would do right by you. And James inherited that pride, that work ethic, that fundamental decency that made him someone you could trust with your life, someone you wanted in your foxhole when things got bad, someone who would never let you down no matter what. He had bright copper red hair that he absolutely hated. hair that made him stand out in any crowd, that got him teased mercilessly as a child, that earned him the nickname Red even though he preferred to go by James or Jim. And he had freckles scattered across his nose and cheeks, and the backs of his hands, freckles that multiplied in the Pacific sun until his face looked like a constellation map, and he had green eyes that sparkled when he laughed, which was often because James found humor in everything, even in the darkest moments, even when we were all scared out of our minds and wondering if we would live to see another sunrise. He had the quickest wit of anyone I have ever known in my 91 years on this earth, the kind of person who could make you laugh even in the worst situations, even when you were terrified and exhausted and wondering if you would survive another day, even when everything around you was falling apart and death seemed certain and inevitable. And his humor was never cruel or mocking. It was warm and inclusive, the kind that brought people together rather than driving them apart. And everyone loved him for it. Everyone wanted to be around him because he made the unbearable a little more bearable, made the impossible seem just slightly less impossible. I was from rural Ohio, from a small farming community outside Toledo called Maumee, and my family had worked the same 120 acres for 3 generations, growing corn and soybeans and alfalfa, raising chickens and pigs and a few dairy cows, and it was hard work, backbreaking work that started before dawn and didn't end until after dark, the kind that ages you prematurely and leaves your hands permanently calloused and cracked and your back permanently bent and aching, the kind that teaches you the value of every single thing you have, because you understand exactly how much effort went into producing it. My father was a quiet man who spoke more with his actions than his words, who taught me about responsibility and commitment and seeing things through no matter how difficult they got. And my mother was the heart of our family, warm and loving and endlessly patient. And I had 2 younger sisters who looked up to me and depended on me and made me understand what it meant to protect someone, to put someone else's needs before your own. James used to tease me about being a country boy, used to imitate my flat Midwestern accent and make jokes about cows and chickens and sleeping with the pigs and not wearing shoes and marrying my cousin. But it was never mean-spirited, never designed to hurt or humiliate. It was the kind of teasing that comes from genuine affection, from real deep friendship, the kind that makes you feel seen and known and valued, the kind that says, I know who you are and where you come from, and I like you. Anyway, in fact, I like you because of who you are, not despite it, because your background and your experiences and your perspective make you interesting and worthwhile. And I would tease him right back about being a city boy who couldn't tell a pig from a cow, who had probably never seen a real farm in his life, who thought milk came from a bottle and eggs came from a carton. And we would laugh together, and the differences between us, the gulf between rural Ohio and urban Massachusetts, between Protestant farmers and Irish Catholics, between cornfields and tenement buildings, would disappear, and we were just 2 young men a long way from home trying to survive a war neither of us fully understood. We met in basic training in San Diego in early 1943, in February when the weather was surprisingly cold and rainy and miserable, and we were both 18 years old, both scared out of our minds but trying desperately to act tough, trying to prove we were men, even though we were really just boys playing at being soldiers, boys who had never been away from home before, never been challenged like this before, never been pushed to our physical and mental limits, and we ended up in adjacent bunks purely by chance, alphabetically assigned, Daniels and McCarthy. And from that first night when we introduced ourselves and shook hands and tried to fall asleep in a room full of snoring strangers, somehow we just clicked. We became inseparable. We became brothers in a way that had nothing to do with blood and everything to do with choice and commitment and shared experience. We looked out for each other through the brutal weeks of basic training, through the 5 a.m. wake-up calls and the endless physical training and the obstacle courses and the weapons drills and the classroom sessions about naval procedures and regulations, through the homesickness that hit us both in waves, usually at night when we were trying to sleep and the darkness made everything worse, through the physical exhaustion that left us barely able to stand, through the constant fear that we were not good enough, that we would fail and be sent home in disgrace, that we would disappoint. our families and ourselves and everyone who was counting on us, and neither of us wanted that. We both felt this overwhelming need to prove ourselves, to show that we were worthy of wearing the uniform, that we could contribute to the war effort, that we mattered in this vast, overwhelming conflict that was consuming the entire world. James wanted to be a journalist after the war. That was his dream, his passion, what drove him and gave him purpose beyond simple survival, and he loved words and stories and the idea of bearing witness to history, of recording the truth and sharing it with the world so that people would understand what really happened, not the sanitized version or the propaganda version or the version that made politicians and generals look good, but the real, messy, complicated truth about what war does to people, how it changes them, how it breaks them, how it forces them to do things they never imagined they were capable of doing. He used to carry a small notebook in his pocket, a battered thing with a brown leather cover that was falling apart from constant use and exposure to salt water and sweat, and he would write down observations whenever he had a free moment. Little details about the people we met and the places we went, descriptions of sunsets over the Pacific that turned the sky colors I had never seen before, descriptions of storms that tossed our destroyer around like a toy, snippets of conversations he overheard in the mess hall or on deck, the fears and hopes and dreams of young men far from home facing death every day. He would read these observations to me sometimes, late at night when we couldn't sleep because we were too keyed up from a battle, or too afraid of what tomorrow might bring, or too homesick for the lives we had left behind. And his descriptions were so vivid, so alive, so full of sensory detail and emotional resonance that I could see the scenes he was painting even in the darkness of our quarters, could smell the salt air and taste the spray on my lips and feel the rolling of the deck beneath my feet and hear the voices of the men he was describing, and I was amazed by his talent, by his ability to capture not just what things looked like, but what they felt like, what they meant, how they affected the people experiencing them, and I told him over and over that he was going to be famous someday, that he was going to work for one of the big newspapers in New York or Chicago, or maybe even become a war correspondent like Ernie Pyle, and he would laugh and shake his head and say he just wanted to tell true stories, stories that mattered, stories that helped people understand the world better, stories that made a difference, that changed hearts and minds, and maybe even prevented future wars by showing people the true cost of this one. He had this idealistic streak that I envied and admired, this belief that words had power, that the truth had power, that journalism could change things, could hold the powerful accountable, could give voice to the voiceless, could shine a light into dark corners and expose injustice and cruelty and corruption. And I admired that about him, admired his conviction and his passion and his refusal to be cynical, even though we were surrounded by cynicism, even though war has a way of crushing idealism and replacing it with cold pragmatism and bitter resignation, even though every day we saw evidence that the world was cruel and random and uncaring. He held on to his belief that things could be better, that people could be better, that truth and justice and decency still mattered even in the middle of a war where millions of people were dying for reasons most of them didn't fully understand. We shipped out together in the summer of 1943, in July, when the California sun was brutal and unforgiving, assigned to the USS Callahan, a brand new Fletcher-class destroyer that smelled of fresh paint and machine oil, and we were proud to be part of her crew. Proud to serve on a ship named after Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan, who had died heroically at Guadalcanal. Proud to be heading into combat, even though we were also terrified in ways we couldn't fully articulate. The Pacific Ocean was bigger than anything I had ever imagined, endless water stretching in every direction as far as the eye could see, so vast and so empty that it made you feel insignificant, made you realize how small you were in the grand scheme of things, how little you mattered individually in the face of such immensity, and yet somehow that made the bonds between us even stronger, made our friendships even more important, because in all that vastness we had each other. We could rely on each other. We could trust each other with our lives and our fears and our hopes for survival. James used to stand on deck at night during the dog watches when he wasn't on duty, and he would look up at the stars, millions and millions of them visible in ways they never were back home, where electric lights washed out the sky and you were lucky to see a handful of the brightest ones. And out here in the middle of the Pacific with no land for thousands of miles in any direction, the night sky was overwhelming, a blanket of light that seemed to go on forever. And he would say that the ocean and the stars made him believe in God, because nothing that massive and that powerful and that beautiful could be random. There had to be some kind of order to it all, some kind of intelligence behind it, some kind of meaning, some reason why we were here and what we were supposed to do with the brief time we had been given. And I wanted to believe him, wanted to share his faith, but I was never quite sure. I had never been particularly religious, and the war was making me even less so, because I could not reconcile the idea of a loving, benevolent God with the reality of what I was seeing every day, with the suffering and the cruelty and the waste of young lives, with the randomness of who lived and who died, with the fact that good people like James could die while others who seemed less deserving somehow survived. Life aboard ship was a strange, exhausting mix of tedium and terror, long stretches of mind-numbing routine punctuated by moments of absolute chaos and violence, and you never knew when the chaos would come. You just had to be ready all the time, had to stay alert and focused, even when exhaustion made your bones ache and your eyes burn, and your mind feel sluggish and slow, even when you had been on duty for 12 or 16 or 20 hours straight, and you could barely remember your own name, much less follow complex orders. James and I worked different shifts because we had different assignments. He was in the engine room as a machinist's mate, second class, responsible for maintaining and operating the massive turbines that powered the ship, and I was a gunner's mate, third class, assigned to one of the 5-inch guns that provided our primary offensive and defensive armament. But we found time to be together whenever we could. We would meet on deck during breaks and shift changes. We would share cigarettes, even though neither of us had really smoked before joining the Navy, but everyone smoked in the service because it gave you something to do with your hands, and because tobacco companies sent cartons to the troops for free. We would drink terrible coffee from tin cups, coffee that tasted like mud and burned going down, but at least kept you awake and alert. And we would talk about home, about the lives we had left behind and the lives we hoped to return to when the war was finally over, when this nightmare finally ended and we could go back to being normal people with normal concerns and normal futures. He had a girl back in Boston. Her name was Catherine Mary O'Brien, and he carried her picture in his wallet, a small black and white photograph that was getting worn and creased around the edges from how often he took it out to look at it, to remind himself why he was fighting, what he was fighting for, who was waiting for him back home with promises of marriage and children and a life together. In the photograph, she was smiling, standing in front of what looked like St. Peter's Church in Dorchester, wearing a Sunday dress with a white collar and holding a small purse, and she had dark wavy hair that fell to her shoulders and kind, intelligent eyes and a smile that lit up her whole face. And James would tell me about her for hours if I let him, about how they had met at a church social when they were both 16, about how she had been serving punch and cookies and he had been too, nervous to talk to her, but his older sister had pushed him forward and introduced them, about how she had the most beautiful laugh he had ever heard, musical and genuine and completely unself-conscious, about how they had started walking out together after that, meeting after Mass on Sundays and going to movies on Saturday nights and taking long walks along the Charles River on summer evenings, talking about everything and nothing, about their families and their dreams and their hopes for the future, about what they wanted to do with their lives and where they wanted to go and who they wanted to become. He told me about how he had proposed to her the week before he shipped out to basic training, how he had saved up for months to buy a small diamond ring, nothing fancy but the best he could afford on his dock worker wages, and how he had taken her to their favorite spot by the river at sunset and gotten down on one knee and asked her to marry him, and she had said yes immediately, had thrown her arms around him and kissed him and cried happy tears, and they had planned to have a small wedding. As soon as he came home from the war, just family and close friends in the church where they had met, followed by a simple reception in the parish hall, and then they would find a small apartment somewhere in Dorchester, or maybe Roxbury where the rent was cheaper, and she would keep working as a secretary while he went to journalism school on the GI Bill. And eventually they would save enough to buy a little house with a yard where they could raise the children they both wanted, 3 or 4 of Them spaced a few years apart, and they would have a good life together. A normal life. The kind of life that millions of people take for granted. But that seems like an impossible dream when you're 19 years old and thousands of miles from home facing death every single day. I had never had a serious girlfriend, had never even kissed a girl, if I'm being honest. I was too shy, too awkward, too focused on helping my family keep the farm running to spend much time socializing. And I used to envy James his certainty, his confidence that Catherine would wait for him, that their love was strong enough to survive the separation and the fear and all the changes that combat inflicts on a person. Because I had seen what war did to men, had seen how it changed them, hardened them, damaged them in ways that were sometimes visible but more often hidden deep inside where no one else could see. And I worried that James would come home a different person and Catherine wouldn't recognize him, wouldn't be able to love the man he had become. But he never seemed to doubt, never seemed to worry. He just had this absolute faith that they were meant to be together and that nothing, not even a world war, could change that fundamental truth. He would write to her every chance he got, long, detailed letters that he would labor over for hours in the cramped quarters we shared below decks, trying to find exactly the right words to express what he was feeling without revealing too much about what he was actually experiencing, because he didn't want her to worry, didn't want her to know how dangerous it really was out here. How close to death he came on a regular basis, how afraid he was that he would never see her again, never get to marry her, never get to have those children they had planned, never get to grow old with her the way he had always imagined. He would write about the beauty of the Pacific sunsets, about the dolphins that sometimes played in our wake, about the flying fish that would land on deck and flop around until someone threw them back, about the meals in the mess hall and the movies they showed on Saturday nights and the friends he had made, especially me, his best friend Harvey from Ohio, who was going to be the best man at their wedding. And he made everything sound almost like an adventure, like a challenging, but ultimately positive experience, when the reality was so much darker and more terrifying than he could ever let her know. She would write back just as regularly, letters that would arrive in bundles when we pulled into port for resupply, sometimes 10 or 15 at once if we had been at sea for a while. And James would read them in order based on the postmark dates, would read each one several times, would carry them around with him until the paper was soft and worn and the ink was smudged from his fingers and from the salt air and the humidity. And sometimes he would read passages to me about her job as a secretary at an insurance company downtown, about her family and what his family was doing, about the rationing and the scrap drives and the bond rallies and all the ways the war was affecting life back home, about the neighbors who had received telegrams that their sons or husbands had been killed, about the gold stars appearing in windows up and down their street, about how she prayed for him every single night and how she was counting the days until he came home and they could finally start their life together. Through her letters, I got to know Catherine a little bit, got to understand why James loved her so much, why he was so determined to survive and return to her. And I would think that if I ever found someone who loved me the way Catherine loved James, someone who would wait for me and write to me and pray for me and believe in our future together, despite all the evidence that the world was a cruel and random place where young love often ended in tragedy, I would be the luckiest man alive. But I never really believed that would happen to me. I was too ordinary, too shy, too damaged by what I was seeing and experiencing to imagine that anyone would want to build a life with me. But the most devastating part of this story, the part that defines everything else, the part that I have replayed in my mind thousands and thousands of times over the past 79 years, is still ahead. And I need you to understand that what happened next was not dramatic or heroic or meaningful in any grand sense. It was just random and sudden and cruel, the way death usually is in war, and it erased the future James had been planning, the life he should have lived, the marriage and the career and the children and the growing old together with Catherine, erased it all in less than a second, erased it so completely and so suddenly that it still doesn't seem real, even after all these decades, still feels like something that happened to someone else in some parallel universe while I somehow escaped unscathed. Even though I know that's not true, even though I carry the scars of that day with me always. We were part of Task Force 38, heading toward the Philippines in the fall of 1944, part of the massive Allied push to retake the Pacific Islands from Japanese control, part of General MacArthur's promised return, and the fighting was more intense than anything we had experienced in our previous year and a half of combat. The Japanese were defending desperately, throwing everything they had at us, and every single day brought air raids and kamikaze attacks and submarine alerts, and the tension aboard ship was unbearable. You could feel it in the air, could see it in men's faces, in the way they moved, in the way they talked or didn't talk. Everyone was on edge. Everyone knew that death could come at any moment from any direction, that there was no safe place, no way to protect yourself completely, that survival was as much about luck as it was about skill or training or preparation, and that knowledge, that understanding that your life could end in the next second through no fault of your own, was corrosive, ate away at your sanity and your hope and your ability to imagine a future. James and I had talked the night before the attack, October 20th, 1944, a date that is burned into my memory as clearly as my own birthday, had stood on deck after his shift ended and mine began, meeting in that brief, precious window when our schedules overlapped, maybe 15 or 20 minutes when we could just be together without any duties or responsibilities. And the night was warm and the stars were out and the sea was relatively calm for once, and we should have been enjoying it, should have been grateful for the peace and the beauty, but James was acting strangely, was unusually quiet and withdrawn, not his normal joking, laughing self, and it worried me because I had never seen him like this before, had never seen him so serious and subdued. I asked him what was wrong, and at first he wouldn't say, just shook his head and stared out at the dark water, and I pressed him, told him we were best friends, and he could tell me anything, and finally he said he had a bad feeling, that something felt different tonight, that he was scared in a way he had never been scared before, not the normal background fear that we all lived with every moment of every day, but something deeper and more primal, like his body knew something, his conscious mind didn't, like some animal instinct was warning him that danger was coming, that his time was running out, and I didn't know what to say to that, didn't know how to comfort him or reassure him, because we both knew that premonitions were real sometimes, that men would get feelings like this, and sometimes they were right, sometimes they died the next day or the next week, and sometimes they were wrong and nothing happened, and they felt foolish for being so dramatic, but you never knew which it would be until after the fact. I told him we were all scared, that fear was completely normal and rational given our situation, that we just had to keep doing our jobs and trust that we would get through this, that we had survived this long against impossible odds, and we could survive a little longer, just had to hang on until the war ended and we could go home and start living our real lives, the lives we had been putting on hold. And he nodded, but I could see in his eyes that he wasn't convinced, that some part of him had already accepted that he wasn't going to make it home, that he wasn't going to marry Catherine or become a journalist or have children or do any of the things he had been planning, and it terrified me to see him like that, to see his hope faltering, because James had always been the optimistic one, the one who kept the rest of us going when things got bad, the one who could always find something to laugh about or be grateful for, no matter how dire the circumstances. He took out Catherine's picture, took it out of his wallet with hands that trembled slightly, and he looked at it for a long time without saying anything, just staring at her smiling face as if he was trying to memorize every detail, trying to burn it into his memory so deeply that nothing could ever erase it. And then he told me in a quiet, serious voice that if anything happened to him, I needed to write to her, needed to tell her that he loved her more than anything in the world, that she was the best thing that ever happened to him, that every moment with her had been a gift, that he was sorry he couldn't keep his promise to come home and marry her and give her the life they had planned together. And I got angry then, told him to stop talking like that, told him nothing was going to happen, that he was going to write to her himself, that he was going to go home and marry her and become a famous journalist who wrote important stories that changed the world, and they were going to have those red-headed children he was always talking about, at least 3 of them, maybe 4, and they would have his wit and her kindness, and they would grow up happy and safe in a world that we were fighting to make better. And he smiled, but it was the saddest smile I had ever seen, a smile that didn't reach his eyes, a smile that said he appreciated what I was trying to do. But he knew better. He knew what was coming, even if I didn't want to accept it. Then his break was over. The ship's bell rang, signaling the change of watch, and he had to go back down to the engine room for his shift, and he clapped me on the shoulder and thanked me for being his friend, for being the brother he never had, for making this whole terrible experience bearable. And he said, "See you later, Harvey." Those exact words, "See you later." And I said, "See you later, James." And he walked away toward the hatch that led below decks, and that was the last time I ever saw him alive, the last time I ever heard his voice. And I have thought about those words every single day for 79 years, have turned them over in my mind endlessly, have wondered if he knew somehow that there wouldn't be a later, that this was goodbye, that within 12 hours he would be dead, and I would spend the rest of my life wishing I had said something more meaningful, something that captured how much his friendship meant to me, how much he had changed me, how grateful I was that chance had put us in adjacent bunks in basic training and brought us together. The attack came just after dawn on October 21st, 1944, at 06:15 hours. I remember the exact time because I checked my watch when General Quarters sounded. Japanese planes appearing out of the rising sun where we couldn't see them until they were almost on top of us, at least 30 of them in multiple waves, diving toward our ship and the other ships in our task force, and immediately the air filled with the thunder of anti-aircraft fire, our guns and the guns. From every other ship in the convoy, all firing at once, 5-inch guns and 40mm guns and 20mm guns, creating a deafening cacophony that made it impossible to think, impossible to hear orders, impossible to do anything except react on instinct and training, except point your weapon at the sky and shoot and hope you were hitting something, hope you were making a difference, hope you were protecting your ship and your shipmates. I was at my battle station manning gun mount 3 on the port side, and I could see the Japanese planes clearly now, could identify them as zeros and vals, could see the rising sun insignia on their wings, and they were diving at us with incredible determination, and we were shooting them down. I saw at least 5 go down in flames, trailing black smoke as they tumbled into the ocean. But there were so many of them, wave after wave, more than we had ever faced before, and they kept coming no matter how many we shot down, kept pressing their attack with a ferocity that was terrifying, a willingness to die that we couldn't match because we wanted to live. We were fighting to survive and go home, but they were fighting with the certainty that they were already dead, that their deaths were meaningful and honorable, that they would be remembered and venerated, and that made them incredibly dangerous. One of the planes broke through our defensive fire, came in low and fast from an angle we hadn't anticipated, skimming just above the wave tops, and I could see it clearly, could see the pilot's face through the cockpit glass, could see his leather helmet and his goggles and his determination, his absolute focus on his target, which was our ship, and I swung my gun around trying to track him, my trainer and loader working frantically beside me, and we fired everything we had, but we couldn't stop him, couldn't change his trajectory, and in that split second, I understood with absolute clarity that he was going to hit us, that nothing we did mattered, that all our training and all our firepower couldn't change what was about to happen. And I braced myself for impact, gripped the railing of my gun mount, and tensed every muscle in my body, and actually closed my eyes, which was a stupid thing to do, but I couldn't help it. And then the world exploded. The plane hit us on the starboard side, just aft of amidships, right where the engine room was, right where James was working his shift, and the explosion was beyond anything I can adequately describe. Louder than thunder, louder than anything natural, a sound that seemed to tear reality itself, that felt like the end of the world, like the universe was coming apart at the seams, and the entire ship shuddered violently, metal screaming and tearing, and I was thrown backward against the bulkhead, with such force that it knocked all the air out of my lungs and left me gasping and disoriented, and for several seconds, maybe longer, I couldn't see anything, couldn't hear anything except a high-pitched ringing in my ears that drowned out every other sound, couldn't move because my body wouldn't respond to my commands, and I thought I was dying, thought this was what death felt like, this confusion and disconnection and inability to make sense of what was happening. When my vision cleared, when I could finally see again, the world had changed. Everything was different. The ship was listing badly to starboard, tilting at an angle that felt wrong, that felt dangerous, and there was fire everywhere I looked, massive flames shooting up from the gash in the ship's side, flames that were orange and red and yellow, and black smoke pouring out so thick and so toxic that men were choking on it, falling to their knees, gasping for air that wouldn't come. And there were bodies on the deck, some of them moving, some of them screaming, some of them silent and still, and some of them burning, and the smell was indescribable. Burning metal and burning flesh and burning fuel oil all mixed together. And I started to retch, but forced myself to stop because I had to move, had to do something. Couldn't just sit there. My first thought, my only thought, was James. I had to get to James, had to find him, had to make sure he was okay. Even though somewhere deep inside, I already knew he wasn't okay, already knew that no one in the engine room could have survived an explosion like that. An impact that had torn through the ship's armor and detonated right in the heart of the machinery spaces. But I had to try, had to see for myself, couldn't just assume, and I abandoned my post, which was technically a court-martial. Offense, but I didn't care. Nothing mattered except getting to James, and I started running toward the engine room access, stumbling on the tilted deck, pushing past other sailors who were running in all directions, some of them going toward the damage to fight the fire, some of them going away from it to escape the smoke and flames, and there was shouting everywhere, officers screaming orders that no one could hear or process, and the ship's alarm was blaring and more explosions were happening, as ammunition cooked off in the heat. Another sailor, a gunner's mate named Peterson, who I barely knew, grabbed me and tried to stop me, yelling that I couldn't go down there, that it was too dangerous, that the entire section had been compromised and might collapse at any moment. But I fought him off, shoved him away with strength I didn't know I had, strength born of desperation and fear and love for my friend. And I kept running, kept pushing forward through the smoke and chaos, and I reached the hatch that led down to the engine room, and it was standing open and heat was pouring up from below, heat so intense that it felt like opening an oven door, like standing in front of a blast furnace, and I could hear screaming from below, men calling for help, voices distorted by pain and terror, begging someone to save them, to get them out, to help them, please God help them. And I started down the ladder, started climbing down into that inferno because James was down there and I had promised to look out for him, had promised his mother when we visited his family before shipping out that I would take care of him. And I couldn't break that promise, wouldn't break it. But I only made it 3 or 4 rungs down before the heat became unbearable, before my hands were blistering on the hot metal, before the smoke was so thick I couldn't see anything, couldn't breathe, before my lungs were burning and my eyes were streaming tears, and I was coughing uncontrollably, gasping for air that wouldn't come, and I could feel myself getting dizzy, disoriented, losing consciousness, and hands grabbed me from behind, multiple hands, and dragged me back up, pulled me away from the hatch, and I was screaming James's name, screaming it over and over until my voice gave out and became just a hoarse croak. But there was no answer, no response, just the roar of the fire and the screams of dying men and the sound of metal groaning and buckling under the stress. And I knew then, knew with absolute certainty, that James was dead, that he was gone, that I would never see him again, never hear his laugh or listen to him read from his notebook, or watch him take out Catherine's picture and smile, and something inside me broke, something fundamental and irreparable, something that has never healed in all the decades since, something that I carry with me still, this empty place where my best friend used to be. The damage control teams fought the fire for the next 6 hours, pumping thousands upon thousands of gallons of seawater, spreading foam, doing everything humanly possible to save the ship, and they succeeded eventually. The fire was extinguished, and the flooding was controlled, and we didn't sink. The Callahan survived to fight another day, but 23 men died in that attack. 23 young men with families and girlfriends and dreams and futures. 23 lives cut short, and their bodies were never recovered because the fire had consumed them, or because they were lost when sections of the hull gave way and flooded, and all that remained of them were dog tags collected from lockers, personal effects to be inventoried and shipped home to grieving families, and names to be added to casualty lists, and the memories of those of us who survived, who had to somehow go on living without them, who had to somehow make sense of a world that allowed such things to happen to. Good people who didn't deserve it.